Hi folks, and welcome back to a video that is going to hopefully be a little shorter than it otherwise would be. I'm on about take 20 of trying to compare this Beretta P38 to a Walther, so-called Walther P38, and I keep getting lost in the details because both these handguns to me are just so fascinating and there's so many things to cover that I'm going to do that. I'm going to take the Beretta out of the way so that I can get lost in the details on this P38 and make sure that I don't miss anything and give you a good overview of this handgun. So it's a P38. It is the standard sidearm of the Wehrmacht during World War II. Introduced in 1938. They didn't really get the production rolling in mass scale until about 1940. This particular one is not a Walther though. Walther of course came up with the design, but this is another contractor. This is a Spreewerk, however you want to say it if we're gonna get a little more authentic, but it is a CYQ, 3-letter code for the Spreewerk factory in Grottau, Czechoslovakia. These have a little bit of a dark past in that the Spreewerk factory in Grottau used quite a bit of conscripted labor. I don't know the exact details on the work arrangement there. I've heard varied things where maybe the workers were compensated, not necessarily willing participants, but nonetheless compensated. I'm not really sure. I've heard that some of them were POWs or Ukrainians pressed into service. Sometimes you hear that they were, just local Czech population. I think there's probably a little bit of truth to all of that, where varying degrees of willingness to participate, varying degrees of compensation versus more or less just slave labor. But they do have a reputation because of that of also being a little bit rougher in finish. Some of the some of the later ones have the cog hammer, which is very distinctive, where instead of this fine serration, you end up with just a few big kind of knots back here. It's definitely very noticeable if you see one. The example in front of us here, though, is actually really, really early production as far as Spreewerk goes. It is a 3-letter serial number with an A suffix. So they had, the first 10,000 had no suffix letter, and then the next 10,000 had the A suffix. So this one being less than 1,000 of the A block, it is one of the first 11,000 P38s to leave the Grottau factory. So kind of interesting in that regard, being just pretty much right at the start of the production run in February of 43. They had only started in the later part of 1942. So pretty early production, right in the heart of the war period. But being early, this one actually shows some fairly nice machine work. Usually on these you see just horrible machine marks all along the sides of the slide, especially. It's really crude. But this one is actually not so bad. It's probably not what you would consider a commercial standard, but for a military production handgun in 1943, pretty good. You can certainly see some swirls from the machines, but not too bad. Not too bad at all. The bluing on this, unfortunately, is not original. It is what is often called a Russian dip blue, where this one at the end of the war ended up in Soviet hands and they refinished them. They re-arsenaled German weapons really in huge numbers You see the Russian captured Mausers and other things, but this is a Russian captured P38, refinished in some Soviet facility. It's a very kind of blackish blue. It's very dark. From what I understand, it's not a very durable finish, although this one has been okay. I mean, obviously I don't beat it up, but it's been an okay finish for what it is. The other features of it are fairly typical for an example of a P38. Has the safety deconker, exposed hammer, slide stop here, very familiar, takedown lever, and the heel type magazine release. It's an 8-shot magazine, single stack. But when you look at it, for a 1930s design, pretty advanced. I mean, to have double action, single action on a handgun, you know, that was only introduced, as far as I'm aware, in 1926 on the Walther PP, which of course is the compact version, is the PPK of James Bond fame. But fairly early, as far as military handguns go, for having a double action, single action mechanism, having a decocker of this type. It strips for cleaning and maintenance pretty easily, which I guess we can go ahead and do now that we've talked about the outside quite a bit. The easiest way I find to do it is just to pull the slide back about like this, flip this lever forward, and then let the slide forward until it's about even, and then gently let the hammer down. I don't like to slam the slide. I'll tell you why. Whenever the hammer's cocked, these components stick up and you're going to hit them if you just let the slide fly. So it's old. I mean, you're talking about a 80-year-old handgun here, so I try to treat it with a little bit of respect. Try to preserve it for future generations to be able to admire it also. But one interesting feature that I think is really cool is it has dual captured recoil springs. Now, so often now, the cool new thing that's been implemented in handguns for the past decade or so, I guess, is captive guide rods, captive recoil springs, where they're assembled to a guide rod so that the spring doesn't go flying off whenever you take it apart. The fact that this is a 1938 design not only has a captured recoil spring, but it has a dual captured recoil spring that is integrated into the frame like this. It's such an interesting way of doing it that I haven't seen on other handguns. I'm not sure why they don't. Maybe it's because this can become fouled a little bit more easily than other things, and it's difficult to clean. But I think it's a cool feature that's done that way. Kind of nice. I love the position of the slide stop and release on these. Being a single stack, it's a fairly thin grip, but very ergonomic. And for me, I find that reaching that is just very comfortable. Not too far back, not too far forward. It has this nice little bump here to keep you from brushing against it accidentally. Keeps it a little protected. Very, very nicely laid out. That's about all there is to see on the frame. Bakelite grips, of course. So an early plastic being implemented on a handgun is pretty cool. They are original grips. I don't think they're actually original for this handgun as far as when it was manufactured. I think these got switched around probably during the Soviet re-arsenaling process. Because I've actually looked up the code in those before I've taken them off and inspected it, and they're not what you would typically expect to see on a Spreewerk of this vintage. So disassembly of the barrel from the slide is simple. push on this little plunger right here. It just comes out the end. This is the locking block. It is a short recoil operated handgun, as most 9mm handguns are, with the exception of a few weird ones. But most of them are short recoil operated. But what you typically see on things like Glocks, HKs, Smith & Wesson, well, not all HKs, there is an exception to that, but what you mostly see, what people are familiar with, is the Browning tilting barrel type of unlocking mechanism, where on the P38, the barrel recoils linearly. It goes straight back and is unlocked by this plunger hitting the frame back here. So it slides back, hits that, which stops the barrel, of course, and then that plunger pushes the locking block down. You see how that happens, which unlocks it from the slide, so the slide can continue to the rear and the handgun can cycle. When it comes back forward, it hits the barrel, pushes the barrel forward until the locking block impacts the frame up here and is pushed up, locking the slide and barrel together. Oops, I just unlocked it by bouncing it around, but normally, of course, the frame would still be under it and it wouldn't just bounce unlocked like that. External extractor. The ejector is down here and is just loose and is held up by the magazine. When the magazine is in, it keeps this held up. So you actually do have to take the magazine out so that this can fall forward and allow for disassembly, which I don't know why you'd be trying to take it apart with the magazine in it anyway, but you do actually have to have the magazine out in order to get that to fall down. The deconker on these is a little bit primitive. You can't fault it too much, but being a 1930s design, whenever you hit the deconker, of course it deconks it, but the way it arrests the firing pin is it is actually just arresting the firing pin. It is blocking the firing pin. And so when the hammer falls, it hits the firing pin, but then the firing pin hits the deconker and doesn't allow it to fire. Not an ideal system. When I deconk these, I typically do it with my thumb rather than using the deconker, just because that's a fairly violent action, having that hammer blow on those parts, and it does risk damage to them. The barrel on this one is really fascinating. Of course, it has its 88 Spreewerk acceptance Waffenamt there, but actually next to it, there's something else, a little asterisk. To the best of my knowledge, that's a rejection stamp. It means that something was wrong with the part to where it did not initially pass its inspection, was sent back for reworking, and then later came through and got its Waffenamt inspection stamp. Of course, you see the eagles on parts here, here, serial number. Oh, that pretty unremarkable. But I just think that it's interesting that this actually failed inspection initially and had to be sent back through for additional work to be done. Slide this back together. Really fairly easy to field strip. The only thing complicated, of course, is making sure that that hammer is decocked and not letting the slide slam. But fairly intuitive and simple. Not having a loose recoil spring. You don't have any of that to deal with. You have no loose guide rod, no loose recoil spring to deal with. So kind of a cool little neat disassembly. Of course, this one here has a import mark, so this ended up in the United States. I'm not sure exactly when, but ended up in the United States as surplus after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Eastern Europe was kind of hurting for money. A lot of things that had been in storage for decades ended up being surplused off, so it made it to the United States that way, and now I get to share it with you and talk a little bit about a really early handgun from one of the lesser known P38 manufacturers, and actually the least prevalent. The CYQ coded Spreewerk pistols only accounted for about 280,000 handguns by the end of the war. So the least out of Walther and Mauser, who also made the P38s. But really interesting example, being so early in their production. Kind of cool that it was captured by the Soviets, actually was in the war. I think it's a really beautiful handgun, very classic styling, but also very modern in many ways. That I think anyone familiar with a double action, single action handgun would find this very intuitive. It's not it's old, but it's still modern enough that it's familiar to us. So thanks for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did, taking a look at really what's one of my favorite handguns in my collection. I love the P38s. I love the different markings and codes and all the production data that is available for these. So if you ever have a chance to pick one up, definitely recommend it. It's just so fun to research them and find out all the different variations as far as how the parts changed throughout the war. There's slight little differences in the profile of the barrels, the profiles of the frames, the hammers. Things changed, and so many different subcontractors were also used in supplying parts that you find different Waffenamps on different parts for various subcontractors. The magazines have different markings from subcontractors. So just a lot of things to look into, and fairly well documented. There's a good bit of information on serial number, production dates, where the different factories were located, kind of the stories that go into that. So really fascinating handguns, one of my favorites, just because there's so much to be known about particular examples like this one. But thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and check back next time when we take a look at that Beretta, and then again after that where we do a comparison between them, because I think you'll find the side-by-side to be really interesting in the end. So thanks for watching, folks. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.